When her coat slid off, the preacher saw chains still around her wrists. The coat was green wool, and it had been somebody else's once. You could tell by the way it hung on her, too wide at the shoulders, the cuffs folded up twice and still dragging. She was sitting on the bottom step of the church when I came around the corner from the woodpile, and the cold had gone past the point where she was shivering. That's a worse sign than shivering. Shivering means the body's still fighting. I got her inside, got the stove going. I was reaching for the coat to hang it up and warm it when the sleeves slipped back, and there they were. Iron, not the bite marks of rope, not bruising from a man's hand. Iron cuffs, the kind with a short length of chain between them, the chain looped back and tied off with a strip of rawhide so it didn't drag. Someone had arranged that. Someone had spent time making sure she could walk without noise. I didn't say anything right then. I finished hanging the coat, poured water from the pot on the stove into a tin cup and set it in her hands. Her fingers had that waxy look. I held my own hands around hers until the cup steadied. Her name was Nora. That's what she told me when she could talk, and I had no reason to think it wasn't true. I didn't ask for a last name. There are times when a last name is either a danger or a wound, and a man with any sense learns to read which before he opens his mouth. I need to back up a little. My name is Caleb Marsh. I have been the minister of a small congregation in the town of Delard, New Mexico Territory, for 11 years. Before that, I was an army chaplain, and before that, I was a young man who thought he understood something about the world, and then I stopped being young, and I understood I didn't. My wife, Agnes, died of fever 6 years into our time here. We had no children. The congregation gave me their condolences and brought food for about 10 days, and then they went back to their lives, which was right and proper. I went back to mine. The thing about being a preacher in a small territory town is that people assume you have some connection to God that they lack, and so they come to you with their worst troubles and expect you to hold the weight of those troubles with grace. What they don't know is that most of the holding is just stubbornness. You learn to stand still when things are heavy. You get used to the heaviness. That's not grace. That's just what happens when you've got nowhere else to put it and no one to put it down for. I was 56 years old the November Nora came to my steps, and I had not expected my life to go anywhere new. So, the chains. She told me about those on the second day, a little at a time, stopping and starting the way a person does when they're not sure how much they'll be believed. She'd been taken in August. She'd been working at a road station 60 miles north of here, cooking, cleaning, and 4 men had ridden in one evening, and by morning she was gone with them. She didn't know where they'd taken her first. She'd been moved twice. One of the men, a man she called Doyle, seemed to be in charge of the rest, or at least the others deferred to him. He was not kind. None of them were kind, but Doyle was the one who'd fashioned the chain arrangement when she'd tried to run the first time. She'd gotten away from them a week before I found her, while they were in a town she didn't know the name of, and she'd walked at night and hidden in draws and creek bottoms in the daytime for a week, and her boots had gone through at the soles, and she'd wrapped her feet in cloth from her underskirt, and that was what I found inside the boots when I finally got them off her. Cloth brown with dried blood. I'm not going to talk about all of what those men did. Nora told me some of it because she needed to tell someone, and she'd decided I was that someone, and I listened to all of it, every word, the way you have to when someone hands you that weight, without looking away, and without making a sound that's about your own discomfort. Some of it I have not been able to fully put down since. That's as it should be. A man who can hear something like that and walk away clean hasn't really heard it. What I'll say is this: she was not broken. That was the thing that struck me most those first days. She was damaged in ways I could see and ways I couldn't, and she was frightened, and she slept with the lamp burning and the chair wedged under the door of the small room off the sacristy where I set her up. But there was something in her that had not given. I can't explain it exactly. You know it when you see it. Some people, when they've been taken apart, the core of them just holds. Hers held. The chains I got off the first morning, with the flat chisel and a hammer, careful on the workbench in the lean-to. It took about 10 minutes. She held very still and watched my hands the whole time and didn't say a word. And when the second one came free, she let out a breath so slow and long it seemed like it had been held since August. I want to be clear about something. I'm a practical man. I'm not the kind who invents meaning out of circumstances. Agnes used to say I had all the poetry of a fence post, which I took as a compliment even knowing she didn't quite mean it that way. So when I tell you that the sound of that breath changed something in me, I'm not reaching for the poetic version of events. I'm just telling you what happened. I had been going through my days in Delard the way you do when your days have a use but not a weight, useful, steady, accounted for. And that sound reminded me what it meant to matter. I am not saying it was about me. I am saying it woke something up that had been sitting quiet for a while. I kept things simple the first week. Food, warmth. Her feet healed faster than I expected. She was strong-bodied under the damage. She slept a great deal. She didn't go out, and I didn't suggest it. The congregation had a Wednesday prayer meeting and a Sunday service, and people came and went, and I told the two women who helped with the church, Miss Sutter and Dora Crane, that I had a guest who was recovering from illness and needed quiet. Miss Sutter took that at face value. Dora Crane did not, but she was a woman who understood that some things required no explanation, and she brought over a pot of beans and a pan of corn bread and didn't ask a single question, which made me trust her more than I'd trusted most people in years. On the 9th day, on a Tuesday afternoon, I was splitting wood out back, and I heard the side door of the church open, and I looked up, and Nora was standing in the doorway. Just standing there, looking at the sky. It was cold and clear, and the light was going flat and gray the way it does in November in the afternoon, and she had her hands in the pockets of the borrowed coat. I'd found her a different one, heavier, that had belonged to Agnes, and that I'd kept without thinking much about why, and she was just looking up. I went back to the wood. I didn't make a production of it, but something shifted in me right then, the way she stood. She wasn't a woman who'd been broken and put back wrong. She was a woman who was deciding what to do next. That's different. She came out and stood near the woodpile after a while. "You don't want to know where I'm from," she said. "I figure you'll tell me if it becomes important," I said. She was quiet for a bit. Then, "You're not what I expected a preacher to be." I told her what I usually tell people who say something like that. I didn't expect it either. That got almost a smile, not quite close enough. Now I have to tell you about Doyle. He came on a Thursday, 2 weeks after Nora arrived. I'd been expecting something, or something like it, maybe not him specifically, but men like him, or a man with a badge and a story, or some form of trouble riding in from the north. I'd been sleeping light. I'd moved the rifle from the closet to behind the sacristy door, which I hadn't done since the year a dispute over a water claim got bad enough that 3 men in the county were killed in 1 month. There were 2 of them, Doyle and one other younger with a scar on his chin. They came to the church door at mid-morning, which was not an accident. Mid-morning on a Thursday in a small town, the street is as empty as it gets. Doyle was a big man, wider than the doorframe or close to it. He had a pleasantness to his face that did not extend to his eyes, the kind of pleasantness that gets put on in front of people and taken off when they're gone. He said he was looking for a woman. He described her not by name, by appearance. He said she was his wife, that she'd gone off in a confused state, that he was very worried. I stood in the church doorway and I looked at him. I have had a long time to think about what I was doing in that moment. I think I was measuring him. I think some part of me that operates faster than thought was going through everything I'd heard from Nora and everything I could see in this man's face, and putting them together into a sum, and the sum came up the same way no matter how many times I ran it. I told him I hadn't seen any woman matching that description. He looked at me a while. The young one with the scar was standing a few paces back, to my left, and I could feel where he was the way you feel a change in the air before rain. Doyle said, "You're a man of God. I'd hate to think you were lying to me." I said, "There's a lot of things I am, mister," and I left that open. He didn't fill in the name. I said, "You're welcome to sit in on Sunday service if you're staying in town. Otherwise, I've got work to get back to." He held there a moment longer, not angry exactly, calculating, and then he said, "All right," in a tone that didn't mean all right at all, and they turned and walked back down the steps. I watched them until they were past the corner of the feed store, and then I went inside and went straight to the sacristy and told Nora to stay away from the windows until I said otherwise. She asked me what they'd said. I told her. She said, "You told him you hadn't seen me." "Yes. You lied." "I did." She looked at me for a moment. There's a kind of looking that isn't really about what it's looking at. It's about something the person is figuring out inside themselves while their eyes happen to be pointed at you. That was the look she gave me. Then she said, "Why?" I didn't have a fancy answer. I said, "Because you came to my steps and the chains were still on you. That's enough reason." She didn't say anything to that. But her eyes got something in them, not tears, not gratitude in the soft sense. Something harder than that, something like a decision. Doyle and the young one left town that afternoon. Floyd Hennessy at the livery told me their horses were gone before sundown. I didn't take that to mean they were done. Men like Doyle don't leave because they were told no. They leave to come up with a better approach. What I did next, I did carefully. I wrote a letter to the county sheriff in Las Cruces, a man named Teague whom I had known for several years and who was not easily impressed by stories but who paid attention when I said a thing was serious. I described what I knew, what Nora had told me, what I could corroborate, the names she'd given me. I told him there were women being held. I said I had a witness. I rode to the next town and sent it from there, not from Dellard. I told Nora what I'd done. She had a right to know. She sat with it for a while, and then she said she'd already decided she would talk to whoever needed to be talked to whenever that became necessary. I want to tell you what that cost her to say, because I watched her say it. It cost her something. Her hands were flat on the table, and she pressed them there, and she said it the way you say something you've decided on before you were fully ready, but you're saying it anyway, because ready is a luxury you don't always get. I told her she didn't have to decide anything that day. She said, I've already decided. That was Nora. In the weeks that followed, it was getting into December now, cold, clear nights and the ground hard, there was a kind of settling. She helped with things at the church. She had a straight, practical way of working, no fuss, and she'd reorganize something and step back and look at it and then adjust it once and leave it alone, and it would be better. She started reading from the small shelf of books I kept in the house adjacent to the church, the house I lived in, where I'd given her the second bedroom. She read steadily and fast, and we talked about what she'd read sometimes in the evenings, and those were the best hours of my day, if I'm being honest. She had a mind that went sideways into things. She'd take a point from a book and find it applied to something that happened 60 years ago and something that might happen tomorrow, and she'd just do that quietly, almost to herself, and I'd follow the reasoning and find it was sound. I was aware of what was happening in me. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't. I'm 56 years old, not 22. I know the difference between a man who's comfortable with company and a man who's in trouble, and I was in the second category. I didn't say anything about it. That wasn't the time and it wasn't my place. She was healing. She needed steadiness, and steadiness was what I had to give. I cooked. That surprises people, a man who can cook, but Agnes had been sick often in the early years, and I'd learned out of necessity, and I'd kept at it. I made stew and biscuits, and I made a rice dish a woman in the congregation had taught me years ago, with dried peppers from the fall garden, and Nora ate like someone who'd been a long time without something that tasted like food was supposed to taste. She told me so. She said it plainly, without making it into something emotional, which was exactly how she said most things. She told me about her life before August in small pieces, not all at once. She was from a town in Colorado, a father who'd run a dry goods store, a mother who'd died when Nora was 14. She'd worked as a seamstress and then as a bookkeeper. She'd been engaged once, years back, and the man had gone away and not come back, which she described without self-pity, the way you describe something that happened to you and not something that defined you. I told her about Agnes. I hadn't talked about Agnes in a while. People stop asking after a time, which I understood it's not comfortable to keep prodding at a loss. But Nora asked because she was interested in the actual life of the person in front of her and not just the useful or manageable parts of it. I told her what Agnes had been like. The sharpness of her, the humor, the way she'd been better at reading a room than anyone I'd known. Nora listened the whole way through and then said, "She sounds like she held you to a higher standard than you would have held yourself." I said yes. She said, "That's a good thing to have had." And she meant it. There was no pity in it, just a recognition of the thing for what it was. I appreciated that more than I would have known how to say. The letter to Teague did something. Not right away, these things move slow, but by January a deputy had come through, and then Teague himself, and Nora told them what she knew, all of it, in my front room with me sitting across the table, and not leaving when she looked at me in a way that said, "Don't leave." Teague was a decent man. He didn't push her into corners she didn't want to go into. He wrote things down and nodded, and asked plain questions, and thanked her when he left. Within 6 weeks, 2 of the 4 men were in custody. One of the others, the young one with the scar, had apparently gotten himself killed in a dispute in Arizona, separately, unrelated, just the kind of end men like that tend to find. Doyle was not caught. Doyle stayed loose, and that would matter. But in the weeks after Teague's visit, something changed between Nora and me. or didn't change exactly, became something we both had to admit was there. It was a Sunday evening in February. The last of the congregation had gone home after the service, and Nora had started coming to the Sunday services by then, sitting in the back row, and people had gotten used to her presence without me having to explain it. I was putting out the lamps and she was straightening the hymnals in the back pew, and I said something, I don't even remember what, and she laughed. A real laugh, not just a politeness, and it stopped me where I stood because I hadn't heard that yet, that particular sound, and it came out of her like something that had been kept behind a door for a long time. I looked at her and she looked at me, and the laugh settled, and she said, "What?" I said nothing, and I went back to the lamps. But she followed me down the aisle, and she stopped when she was close, and she said, "Caleb," not Minister Marsh, Caleb. I turned around. She said, "I know what you've done. I know how you've done it. You've been..." And she stopped, and she chose the word the way you choose the right tool for something that matters. She said, "You've been the steadiest thing I've ever had to hold on to, and I know what that cost you to be." I said, "It didn't cost me much." She said, "Don't do that." So I didn't, I just looked at her. She put her hand against my chest, not a dramatic gesture, just flat against my coat over the sternum, the way you put your hand on something to feel if it's solid. She kept it there. She said, "I'm not saying this because I owe you anything. I want you to know that. I'm saying it because it's true." I covered her hand with mine, that's all. I just held her hand there against my chest, and we stood in the almost dark of the church, the last lamp still burning on the far wall, and neither of us said anything for a while. There are moments that don't require anything added to them. That was one. Doyle came back in March. I heard about it from Floyd at the livery before I saw him. Floyd had good eyes and better memory for faces. He came to find me on a Tuesday morning and told me there was a man in town that matched the description I'd given him months back. Big man, pleasant look to him that wasn't pleasant, and he'd asked Floyd some questions about the church. I'm going to tell you what I felt because I think a man should be honest about this kind of thing. I felt something cold run down through me, straight to the feet. I felt it. And then I put it somewhere, the way you put things when you can't afford to let them run, and I went and found Nora. I told her I didn't soften it. She needed the whole truth so she could make a whole decision. She said, "All right." I said, "I want you to go to Dora Crane's place and stay there today." She said, "No." I said, "Nora." She said, "No, this is my business. I'm not going to sit somewhere safe while you deal with my business." We looked at each other. I could see she'd already thought about this exact moment or one like it, and had her answer ready. She'd been ready longer than I'd known she was getting ready. I said, "Then stay close to me." She said that was always the plan. I sent word to Teague. That took time we might not have. What I had was the rifle, and I had Hector Sandoval, who ran the smithy and was a steady man and owed me nothing except trust, and I asked him to put himself somewhere useful. Doyle came to the church in the afternoon, which he probably thought was clever, fewer people around, the light going. He came alone this time. Maybe the others had gotten cautious. Maybe he was confident enough on his own. He was the kind of man who'd been confident for a long time because confidence had always been enough. I met him at the door. He looked at me a long while. Then he said, "Last time you lied to me." I said, "Last time you lied to me too, called her your wife." He didn't like that. A man like Doyle doesn't like being caught in a lie by a man he's decided is beneath him. Something moved across his face. He said, "I want her." I said, "I know that. You're not going to get her." He said, "You think you're going to stop me?" I said, "Yes." Not bravado, just the plain fact of it. I have found in my life that there are moments when plain fact is the hardest thing you can put in front of a man. I won't make this into more than it was. Hector was positioned at the corner of the building, and when Doyle's hand went to his gun, Hector stepped out, and there was a moment, one of those seconds that stretches out sideways, where you can feel the weight of what might happen in each direction, and Doyle read the room and his hand came down. He was arrested 2 days later by a deputy Teague sent, on the strength of what Nora had told them plus a warrant that had been working its way through the court since January. He was not a man who'd get loose easily again. I don't know what happened to him after that. I didn't particularly want to know. What I remember from those 2 days between when Doyle backed down and when the deputy came is this. That evening after it was done, after Hector had gone and the street was quiet again, Nora came and stood beside me at the church door while I was watching the last of the light go out of the sky. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she put her arm through mine, the way you link arms with someone you've decided to stay next to. She said, "Were you frightened?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good. Frightened men think better than brave ones." I laughed. I don't laugh easily, and I know it, and she knew it too by then. And when it happened, she looked sideways at me with something in her face I'd been careful not to examine too closely for weeks. I examined it then. I said, "Nora, I'm 56 years old." She said, "I know how old you are." I said, "I don't know what I'm offering you." She said, "I do, and then that's enough, Caleb." We were married in May, in my own church, with me Sutter crying in the front row and Dora Crane handing her handkerchief to me and then kneading it back. Hector stood up with me, which seemed right. Nora wore a dress she'd made herself over the winter, gray-blue, very plain, and she walked up that aisle like a woman who decided something and was done second-guessing it. She is not a soft woman, I want to be clear about that. She is not the kind of woman who makes things easy by being yielding. She argues with me. She's wrong sometimes and right more often than I'd prefer, and she knows it. She reads everything she can get her hands on, and she has opinions about all of it. She reorganizes my shelves, and then I can't find anything for a week, and I'm too proud to ask where she put it. She has nightmares sometimes, less often than she used to. When she wakes, she gets up, and I hear her, and I don't pretend I don't hear her. I get up too, and we sit at the kitchen table while the stove ticks and the dark does what dark does, and sometimes we talk and sometimes we don't. She's told me she would not trade those hours for a dreamless sleep, because in those hours she is most certain about what is real and what she has. I don't know if that's wisdom or stubbornness, and I've decided it doesn't matter. She asked me once, in the way she does, sideways, looking at something else, what I'd thought when I came around the corner of the church that November morning and saw her on the steps. I thought about that. I said I'd thought she was cold and she needed to get inside. She said, "That's all." I said at the time, "Yes, that's all." She smiled. She has a smile that she doesn't give out widely, and I've come to think of it the way I think of water in dry country. It means something when it shows up. She said, "And now?" I told her the truth. I said that when I came around that corner, something in my life changed direction, and I hadn't known it was going to, and I still couldn't have told you why it was her, and why it was that morning, only that it was. She nodded like that confirmed something. We are in our 4th year now. The congregation has grown a little. There are children in the territory who call me Reverend Marsh and know nothing about any of it, which is exactly right. Dellard has gotten bigger and a little louder, and there are men here now I don't fully trust, and that is the nature of a town when it grows. Nora tends a kitchen garden in the warmer months. She keeps the books for 2 businesses in town because she has a head for numbers, and she gets bored otherwise, and boredom in Nora produces an energy that has to go somewhere. She helps me when I need it, and she lets me help her when she needs it, which she does not always advertise, but which I've learned to recognize. There is a morning thing we have, not a ritual exactly, not deliberate enough to be a ritual. I am usually up first, and I get the coffee going, and by the time I'm done she's up and she sits across the table from me with her hands around the cup, and she looks out the window at the morning coming in, and she doesn't say anything for a while, and neither do I. It is, I think, the best part of my day. I have never said this to her. I don't need to. I came around a corner with an armload of firewood, and there was a woman on my steps, and the chains were still on her wrists, and I stood there and I looked at her, and I made a decision without knowing I was making one. Everything after that was just staying in the direction of that decision. I don't know what that says about God's hand in things. I am a man who has spent his life working around that question. But I know what I found when I came around that corner, and I know what I have now, and I know what kind of man it took to hold still long enough to get here. That's what I've got. That's all, that's enough.